Great. Thank you, Christy and Ken, for talking with us today about Zone 1 for Portland Public Schools. You guys are both running for the position. Christy, you're currently in the position. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and why you think voters should send you back for another term.
Great. Yeah. So I actually just got appointed to the school board. So I'm an incumbent, but I don't have the same length of tenure as most incumbents do. I have 3 months of incumbency, and it's been quite a whirlwind between the bond and the budget. And so just making sure everybody knows from the beginning that I am brand new to this work. So what motivated me to run was frankly spending the last 4 years, really since the pandemic, being in an elementary school in Portland for at least a couple of hours a week. I was the PTA president right after the pandemic, supported the school during that time when we had the staffing crisis and it was hard to get subs and educational aides, and we had a lot of extra work to do given distancing. I did a lot of work taking lots of vacation time to be there to kind of patch things up. And from that experience on, have regularly been in our elementary school and really have seen that combination of the magic that happens in our public school when things are going well, and then also when those gaps are evident, or what happens when there's not a lot of support or room for error. And let's say you have a teacher absence, which has happened to both of my daughters for an extended period of time. The article last weekend really hit home for me. And so for me, what motivated me to run was really that desire to serve, having seen the issues, but then also having the experience that I have in my day job. I've worked in public policy for about 20 years. Before that, I got a master's in education and started my career as a social studies teacher. And I've also continued to volunteer regularly in our schools. Before my kids were born, I was a Constitution team coach for 12 years at one of our PPS high schools, which is an amazing program, like the best of the best in our public schools, frankly. And I'm also an alumni of that same program, by the way, but not here. But all of those experiences, I think, make it so that I can walk into a school board role and be able to really connect the issues we're having day to day in our schools with that experience I have in public policy in order to really make a change, not just at the district level, but frankly, I think Oregon has an issue overall. And I think members of a school board can also have the ability to help make things better for our districts, but also speak up in general to help state leaders and others better understand what's going on day to day in our schools, because I think they are often pretty disconnected. So the reason I think I should get selected to come back and actually complete the term that I just started a few months ago is I think that I've already demonstrated that I can do the work, and that I'm really committed to our schools and our students and our staff, and committed to both kind of righting the ship at PPS with new leadership there, but also continuing to work on advocacy to make our schools better in Portland and beyond.
Great, thank you very much. Ken, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and why you think voters should choose you.
Sure. Yeah, quick background on me. So dedicated my life to academics and education. Up until 2011, I was basically a professional student and researcher. Left and joined industry and then became a member of the American corporate world ever since. Everything from small, scrappy startups to private mid-sized companies to private small companies to very large technical organizations, publicly traded companies. So I've seen a little bit of everything. I think the key question is always, why am I running for school board? I do not have children, so I don't have a direct attachment with kids in the school system. Quite frankly, like I said, I was a professional academics. I dedicated my life to education and learning, and this is very personal for me. I mean, as it is for everybody. I love education. I think it's important for everybody, people who look like me, people who don't look like me, to have the opportunity to receive a high quality education like I did. Everything from kindergarten to elementary, middle, high school, to going to college to postgraduate work. That opportunity needs to exist for everybody in this country. And so for me, living here in Portland and sort of the state of our school system, and especially the negative sentiment around the state of our school system, and more importantly, the active assault on public education in this country now, it was incumbent upon me to get off the sidelines and get involved. I have a tremendous amount of experience, and understanding of the educational system, like I said, from everything all the way up from elementary school to college. not just being a student, but also participating, going and talking to, teaching classes at the college and postgraduate level, to also going and doing volunteer work at elementary schools, middle schools, participating in all sorts of technical education, after school programs, and for primary and secondary schools. This is just something that's near and dear to my heart. I've got a tremendous amount of leadership experience with extremely large, complex organizations as well. PPS, if it were a business in Portland, it would be one of the largest ones in terms of revenue, not revenue, budget, and also actual employees and students in the system, in addition to their parents. I mean, this is a very large, complicated system that services a lot of people. And this is the sort of thing that I think that somebody with my fairly diverse background is extremely well suited to jump in and tackle. And so for me, this just seemed like a very obvious fit. And so I got off, like I said, got off the sidelines and decided to participate.
Great, thank you very much. And Ken, if you can go first on this question, we'll just kind of bounce back and forth.
Sure.
Tell me, first of all, I guess, what schools have you been visiting and or been working in? And secondly, what would be your top priority for, if you were elected?
Sure. Yeah, no direct visits or work in the schools here in Portland so far. That is not something that I've made the rounds and have done. Gotten a lot of invitations to come and speak at a lot of schools from now up until Election Day, which will be great, interacting with the community. I moved to Portland in December of 2020. And so most of my actual in-school experience and activity has been when I lived back in Atlanta, Georgia, or when I lived in Michigan, also when I was in Canada, and then again when I was also in France for postdoc work. Sorry, the second part of your question?
What would be your top priority? What
Oh
would
yeah,
you want
top
to focus
priorities.
on coming?
Yeah, pretty straightforward for me. It is a well-known fact that student achievement in the PPS system has been declining over the last decade. And so while graduation rates, it's fantastic that they are up. It is good that students are getting their high school diplomas. Just the system is not supplying students with the learning and education necessary to have them hit just those benchmark levels. Let's just talk about standardized tests. Those achievement scores just aren't where they need to be. And that is extremely concerning to me because it's in the name, it's public education. And if students aren't receiving a measured, and we can debate about what the measurement should be, but by any one of the measures that you would like to select, that achievement, which is a very broad term, is not at the benchmark levels where we desire it to be. And so that is my first and primary focus. And that is something that obviously everybody in the PPS system is, that is the mission. They are teachers, educators, administrators, everybody's on board with raising those achievement levels. And so one of the questions I've had, if that is the case, specifically, especially with the PPS board in the past, why hasn't that been like the number one burning priority every single year after year? I mean, even now, it barely ever comes up in any conversations, which I find to be an incredibly ugly indictment of kind of the way that the PPS board currently is running the system, especially in conjunction with the superintendent who has made it a priority. And that's extremely concerning for me. And then next on the tier is obviously spending and budgeting. There are fiscal constraints, there are fiscal realities that we have to deal with. And so while we would like to have, for example, smaller class sizes, which means having more teachers, which means having more classrooms, we would like to have a lot of new programs. The realities are also that the money is not currently there to maybe do all of that, while also, for example, prioritizing achievement. And so that means having to have really ruthless and relentless focus on the activities and programs that will center on that number one priority, which is student achievement. So those two things in conjunction, I think, are really critical. And then the third pillar for me is educator empowerment. It's really important that educators love their jobs and they have a great work environment. They're the ones that show up every single day, that are extremely passionate, that are making this happen. And so as the public, we need to make sure, and especially as the system and as the board, we need to make sure that we are providing with the environment necessary for them to want to show up, to want to do that job, and continue to stoke that passion so they feel motivated, they feel inspired. And those are my priorities.
Great, thank you. I do want to get back to something that ask you something, but I want to first ask Christy just if you can tell us a little bit about the schools you've been visiting or working with, and also what your top priorities would be.
Right. So I'm going to start actually chronologically. I spent 12 years as a coach at Lincoln High School, coaching their Constitution team and getting to see really an excellent program, and also be around a ton of young people that just show what a high quality public education can get you, and have now watched all of my alumni do so many great things. Like just last week, New York Times story about Constitution team written by an alumni of the program was pretty cool. So that's one thing I want to share. I also want to share what it felt like to take Lincoln High School kids to Lake Oswego High School. These were mostly sophomores, and we had to go there for district or regional competition every year. And they would walk in the door of that school, they would get off the bus and just immediately be oohing and eyeing about that school and how it felt for them, having come from Lincoln, which was frankly falling apart, to a beautiful, shiny new high school. So that's part of the reason why you'll always find me being a supporter for finding funding to modernize, repair, rehabilitate, whatever it takes, our schools, which really do have a lot of issues, top to bottom, in old buildings. And then my kids go to school at Hayhurst in Southwest. I've spent time in several other schools since becoming a school board member, but the vast majority of my experience has been at Hayhurst. We've had cuts in our classrooms for 4 years. We are one of those schools in the district that have had cuts. Really, even when we had the ESSER funds flowing, we were still getting cut. Even before we had declining enrollment, we were getting cut. I'm not super sure why our little school had that situation, but definitely learned a lot about the importance of resources and staffing. And so my top priority, from really the minute that, even before I became a school board member or even thought of running for office, was how do we get the resources that our kids need to succeed? I don't disagree with anything Ken said. Like, we have the same list of priorities. We care about student achievement. We want our schools to be a great place to work. We also want to make sure we're being good stewards of how we spend our dollars. I guess I would just add that my approach on this is not just that it's like a budgeting issue, but that it's a revenue issue. How do we get enough dollars into our school districts to account for, let's say, finding out that our PERS costs dramatically increased over the winter? And that's why we now have the cuts that we have in our schools. How do other states don't have that same situation? How do we learn from other states that do have that dynamic and figure out how to make sure that our kids are getting the resources? 4 years ago, you used to see educational aides in our hallways doing one-on-one tutoring, the same high dosage tutoring that you hear all about in literacy conversations. We had that at our school 4 years ago, and we haven't had it since. We've lost most of our funding for educational aides in our school. So I want to do all I can to get resources to those kids that need to increase their performance so that they can be readers by 3rd grade and then continue to be successful as they move through process. But I think first things first is readers by 3rd grade.
Great, thank you. And Christy, if you can go first, what do you think are the key stumbling blocks to helping improve kids' achievement? There has been, despite cuts that you may be seeing, there has been an increasing amount of funding devoted to K-12 education. Why is PPS not seeing the gains that others are?
Yeah, it does seem like it's an Oregon-wide problem. It's Portland actually has had relatively, I don't want to defend our test scores, but I'm about to, but relatively flat. We know other places are seeing that more money and decreasing scores. So I think there's evidence that our district is doing some things right, and maybe doing more things right now that we have new leadership and kind of a new focus on that literacy literacy work that Dr. Armstrong has been really prioritizing in her work, and I think that's right where we should be. Like I said, what I just said before is I really think that we need to take a close look at school funding in Oregon. When I talked to Dr. Rosa at Edunomics and found out that HERS benefits were considered part of school funding, and when you look at school funding and compare us to other states, that includes our payouts to our retired teachers. As she put it, was our choice to continue to make those payouts and to not invest more in classrooms. And so I really would love to see like a conversation about, I'm not going to say, we all know what happened. We can't, contract's a contract. I support those teachers getting what they were promised now that they're retired and are depending on those dollars for their retirement. But how can we like decouple school funding from that dynamic so that we can actually see what we really are investing in our classrooms? And I think there's some conversation about accountability that kind of get toward like how our district's spending their dollars and figuring out how they can be better stewards of those resources. And I'd really support state work on that, both increasing adequacy, because we know that we are not adequately funding our schools, but also how do we, on the same point, like as we're increasing school funding, make sure that we're implementing best practices. Like, wouldn't it be cool if we fully funded schools and had the average number of school days or even more than compared nationally to where we have fewer school days? We're expecting our teachers to do and our kids to succeed despite being in school less time, for example. So I think we have big problems that will take years and decades to fix, and I'm committed to doing that work. And as a school board member, as a parent, and just generally as somebody who's been working in public policy for 2 decades and really devoting myself to this going forward.
Great, thank you. Ken, same question for you. What do you think are the stumbling blocks in the way of better achievement?
Sure. Yeah. So that term, right, achievement, it's just it's so incredibly broad, and it does mean something broad to me. And I just wanted to start with that, which is test scores are the first component because that is the thing that gets published. It gets rolled up in the national report card. That's what researchers use for analysis purposes. Those are the numbers that I've been looking at that everybody else looks at. But achievement obviously is broader than that. It should include all the other activities that students are participating in academically, all the way up from, through K through 12. That unfortunately doesn't wind up on paper and it doesn't wind up in the books. And so, in these conversations, I'm really going to hit that point hard, achievement. And so I just want to narrowly focus and say, I am talking about the actual test scores. And that is just a flat fact because we do have to have a benchmark for comparison. So in this conversation, I like to think about scope of control. And I agree, and if you look at, for example, like my policy list that I have on my website, there's a long list of things that I'd love to see from a spending perspective that we quite frankly just don't have control over. The PPS would be specifically involved in not just advocacy, but activism associated with helping write, for example, like legislation and pushing and organizing parents and students and educators to try to get state officials and city officials to do their job. And quite frankly, they just don't. And I think that's a really big part of the conversation that gets left out. So I'm going to skip over the budgeting and funding piece because it would be nice, for example, to have, yes, more teachers, more educators, more support staff that are, for example, Christy already alluded to, 2 things that are near and dear to my heart, which are high dosage tutoring, getting closer to that one-on-one mentorship with students. And additionally, early literacy programs, which you already currently have in the system, but they're very heterogeneous the way they're deployed across the schools. So with all that said, the thing that is a mystery to me, and this is why I said, in my initial answer, I think this is the biggest indictment of the PPS board now and probably over the last maybe 10 years, is I quite frankly don't know why student achievement is so low. I am completely at the mercy of the data that we have access to. And right now, the data, especially over the last 4 years, the budget data, it's very difficult to follow exactly the money that's flowing into the system, how it specifically winds up in achievement-related programs like CTE programs, for example, how it specifically winds up in those programs at the school level. And I'm not saying these funds are being abused, there's any fraud or being misspent or anything. It's just difficult to understand, okay, well, what's the efficacy of these programs? And could we be, for example, are there underfunded programs in the system that are helping raise student achievement at certain schools that if we dump more money into them or deployed those programs in other schools, we'd see, for example, like a, 5% increase in test scores, something like that, as were other programs that might be underfunded and aren't returning results in terms of increasing achievement in language arts or science or mathematics. And I think that's my biggest complaint is I have to answer this question with I quite frankly don't know. Like everybody knows this is a problem, but there is no explanation for exactly why. We have some speculation, and like I said, the early literacy program, that is a well-researched, well-documented, evidence-backed conclusion, which is early literacy, third grade scores are critical to ensuring, late stage student achievement. And we have those programs in the PPS system right now, but again, they're very heterogeneous. And so that's the first order of business would be, it'd be nice to see those programs. When I say, make them more homogeneous across system, I'm talking about staff training, structure, the actual program content, the schools that have access to them, the materials that go into those programs. Those are the sorts of things that I would like to focus on first.
So that sounds like, I mean, that would be something that you would need to potentially add positions in a central administration to track.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, I've spent a lot of my spare time doing a lot of budget analysis over the last about 6 to 8 months, trying to figure out sort of how exactly the system runs, and it's difficult to say the least.
Well, let's talk about the budget actually.
Sure.
We're facing, I mean, PPS has already cut for the current year. They're going to be cutting next year. What are your thoughts in terms of what the district should be doing to either stabilize budgets or
Yep.
boost enrollment or anything along those lines?
Right. So I think this is where my experience outside of the educational system becomes critically important because I have been, like I said, I've been in everything from literally a small startup all the way to my current role where I'm at a Fortune 10 company, and so I've seen these kinds of budgetary decisions either having to make them or participating in them or being subject to them. And the cruel reality of fiscal constraints is that you do have to prioritize things. You cannot have 1A and 1B. There is only number one and number two, number three, all the way down to a cut line. And that cut line is when you look at it and go below and say, okay, well, how much do we carve out of any one of these individual areas or programs before they become ineffective? Because it could be that for example, like a budget item that's like number 20 on the list in terms of priority. It has a very small footprint, but it is effective. And so you keep it at the sacrifice of, for example, number 19 on the list. So that would be my first order of business. And one of the key features that goes into that prioritization, in my opinion, is you can't touch the classroom. We already know the house is on fire. Student achievement is way underwater where it should be. And so anything that is going to go into impacting the classroom, those are the things that probably have to be prioritized first and preserved. And then it comes to everything else. And that everything else, I mean, there's a very long list. And a lot of times it does come in wholesale programs where you have the same staff who might have to be retrained and shift over to working another program. If they don't have that skill set, you try to upskill them. And if you can't, sometimes you're talking about having to let people go as well. And I'm not saying like that is my perspective going into budgetary decisions. But the fact of it is that you can't have everything for nothing. And I find it to be an extremely unnecessary, like I said, I want to go back to something that's really important though. I find this to be an extremely unnecessary discussion. And that's where I think about for elected city officials and state officials. I would love to have them come to PPS board meetings and to defend the decisions that they have made in the past that are strangling schools in Oregon to death because they don't have enough funding and are having to make these unsavory decisions about the budgets.
And when you're talking about the city, in what aspect?
Yeah, so one of the big things that gets under my skin, in fact, there's a proposal up right now. I'm eager to see exactly how these TIF regions that have been proposed, who gets to sit on these committees. I've obviously applied to be a member of one. I don't think my application's going to get accepted, but I'm really eager to see how these TIFs, these TIF sectors get split up and exactly who gets to sit and make these decisions. Because again, I've only been a citizen of Portland in Oregon for a couple of years now. But here's one of the things that I've known. My family's been in Oregon for 30 years. One of the things I know is that a lot of these decisions, as with everywhere else in the country, when they get made, they prioritize certain people first. And wealthy developers are one of the people that usually wind up at the top of that pile. And what winds up happening is that public schools are a real easy target for stealing funds. Because because there's nobody to really press back, right? It's easy to just kind of cut money. Oh, look, student achievement is so low in PPS. What if we carve more money out of their budget and then hand it back to this group of investors at no consequence because the public's not going to repel against that. And so, that's one specific area. And then on my website, I got a whole host of other things that, policies around these, especially at the city level, that kind of annoy me when it comes to raising public funds for education.
Okay. Okay. So you're talking about city policies that affect funding because,
Oh, yeah,
okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
And just to make this a little bit just more specific, what would you cut?
What would I cut? Well, that's the thing is I can't say specifically what I would cut because
Okay, what
the
are your
problem is
lowest priorities then? You said you want to keep, you don't want to cut from the classroom. So where are you cutting from?
yeah, so this would involve central office administrative. That's usually the first place that you have to go. It's kind of like the G&A bucket in most budgets, because that what you've done is you've isolated then the schools, and you start to carve out as much of the actual support that you can without making the system collapse.
Okay. Great, thank you. Christy, in terms of the budget, what are the things that you would cut? What are your lowest priorities and what would guide your decision making?
Ooh, different question. Okay. So sorry, I wrote down the other one. Let me
And
pivot.
you're free to go wherever you
Okay,
want.
okay. I've been thinking about what we should do to stabilize um and enrollment and things like that. Well, I guess first of all, I'll just say I've been from the beginning of running talking about making sure we're protecting our classrooms from cuts. I am convinced that after the substantial cuts to our district office last year, and then I believe we're doing something like 36 more staff being laid off from the central office now. I'm not so sure how much more we can cut from that central office, despite my strong desire to keep cuts there. And I don't know, I don't know if Julie is already reviewing it, but I got on Friday night when I got home from being out to dinner, I got 400 pages of budget report.
Volumes
And
1 and 2.
which I'm supposed to be ready to like talk about conversantly by tomorrow. Wish me luck. My kids did not decide to leave me alone all weekend like I'd hoped they might, so I could dig into the extent possible. But I'm like, I don't know, 100 pages in. And so to me, I really am trying to kind of dig in and figure out like where are there still things in the central office that I think can go. But 40 million in cuts after what 36 million last year, it's just really hard. And I'm not gonna like lie and say that I think that I can be like a superhero and protect our classrooms from cuts. I see what we're doing to keep class sizes lower, and I think there are some schools that do have outlier high class sizes for sure. There's also schools with really low class sizes too, which is interesting to think about. And I think being creative about grade blending at some of those schools that are really under enrolled is where we are. And nobody likes that. I remember a few years ago, like I said, we've had cuts at our school for 4 years. We had a couple of years with blending and all the parents hated it. But then it was our strongest teachers and they kind of handpicked the classes to make it work. And it seems like once it happened, people didn't complain too much. So I know that's just one sample size, but I'm not going to stand up and say that I think like blending is wrong. I think we're trying to do what we can with fewer resources, and some of those cuts are going to be painful, but I think everybody's kind of trying to do their best and make it work.
And
I can tell you,
let me just follow up real quick on that.
Yeah.
So are you talking about looking at or changing the staffing ratios in Title I classrooms to perhaps kind of even out some of the staffing?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Julie and I are looking at the budget. We know that's what's happening. Yeah, it's there's a slightly higher top class size for Title I and slightly higher top class size for non-title. At my school is I think like 10 kids shy of being a Title I school. We have 31% underserved. It to be 33 to be Title I. That's part of how we've ended up being cut for so many years. But our class sizes are low enough that we're like in the mid-20s, so we're not subject to that, but there are a lot of schools that really do get hit hard when those changes are made because of their enrollment. And so you asked what we would do to stabilize. What about enrollment? Well, one thing is that this is partially the fiscal cliff that we all were warned of the pandemic funds running out, right? If the economy continues to struggle in a way that affects PERS returns, which is what happened and is costing us money, then we'll be in a cut situation in the future, which is why it goes back to it'd be nice if our school funding didn't have to be as tied up with that. But right now we're not projecting to have to do major cuts next year. We're making those cuts now as a result of kind of that fiscal cliff plus the changes, like I mentioned, to retirement benefits. Declining enrollment is like a top priority of mine. We've had it at our school. I cried in a school board, not public, but in a meeting not too long ago about declining enrollment. And I think people were taken aback, but it's been so hard to see families leave public school for private school at our school, which is like a wonderful school. We've just had some issues with staffing. We have a special ed program at our school that's been understaffed, and when that's understaffed, it causes issues for other classrooms, and that's certainly been the case for us. We've also had teacher absences that's caused people to have concerns. And so we've been in it. We are actually losing a bubble class. We're going to have like a drop of like 20 just this year to next year at our school. So I'm seeing it live. I'm seeing it happen. It really hurts. And I know what's made it better and how we've gotten some private school parents back and kids back, I should say, is just really, we have a lovely school and us all talking about it and really getting out there and talking to our neighbors, finding our people who are starting kindergarten and letting them know, like, we know that especially last year was really tough and with the ice storm and the strike, and parents choosing not to enroll in kindergarten last year was really obvious in our school. And so how do we like get those families back? And I think it's really just been great seeing a lot of those families coming back, or kindergarten families showing up for our Connect to Kindergarten this spring after we've really done a lot more outreach work than we've traditionally sort of had to do. We're like having to sort of market like private schools do, I guess, with fewer resources, of course, but a lot of people that care.
Okay. Let me ask you also, just with enrollment declines, it's not just people opting for private schools, it's also a declining birth rate. Would you consider closing the schools? Is that on the table for you? And I'm sorry, Christy, if you can go first on this, I think.
I'm grappling with the end of a cold and a little bit of a cough, so sorry if I'm muting and getting water. I'm doing okay, but so I actually want to learn more about this because I've heard now, since I've joined the board, about schools that do have just really obvious low enrollment. We also have had parents collectively reach out from a PTA that are interested in seeing their own declining enrollment in being moved to another school. So I think that there's actually families out there that are realizing, like, wow, we like don't have a librarian every day anymore. Like, our school has just gotten too small. Our school just crossed below the threshold and will have fewer art, PE, library opportunities because our kids just went under a threshold for where you lose some of those support, or like special supports, I guess. And so schools are kind of having that moment of like, wait, maybe it'd be better, my kids would have more if we were in a bigger school. So I think we should find places where parents are pretty open to it to start with and kind of see how that can go. And it's every time though, it's usually really painful. So I think as a community, just how do we approach the problem together? I'm certainly open to it, but I really want to listen and learn and make sure that we're doing those school consolidations in a way that isn't harmful for the kids that really need school the most, and really are the ones who we want to make sure we take the best care of: low-income kids, kids of color. So I want to be sure we're not like just doing things in kind of those parts in those schools, really making sure that it's a district-wide conversation and everybody's in it together.
Okay, thank you. Ken, how about you? Just facing declining enrollment, is closing a school something that you would consider, and what other measures would you look at?
Yeah, sure. Until you said it just now, I realized that the other day in an interview, I referred to the birth rate as the fertility rate. So anybody that sees that interview is going to get a kick out of that. It hit me just now. I was like, oh my God, he's the wrong term. Yes. So there's a couple of things to this, right? So PPS sits on a lot of unused property that for whatever reason is not being leased out to any interested parties. I mean, that's one of the things that strikes me. Now, I'm not saying that unused property has anything in relation to the question that you just asked. I just wanted to point that out because I think it sits in somewhere in like the top 10 of property holders in the Portland metro area, which sort of struck me by surprise, especially when you start to realize that a lot of these dilapidated properties could either be sold off or leased out. And so when it comes to this question then of the property that is currently being used for school purposes, again, it comes back to this question of prioritization. So I have to be honest. I hate talking about these fiscal issues with the school, because this is with the schools, because this is just so intentional. Like these funding problems go up the chain, and it's like this just feels like such an unnecessary problem for PPS to be having. But yes, okay, in a situation where funding doesn't come through to backstop these budgetary shortfalls and basically get rid of this this what was it, $105 million deficit that we originally were tackling a couple years ago. Yeah, you do have to start to consider the possibility that, on the list of properties, if they are being underutilized, that if there is a reasonable plan, and I think that that term, again, I'm not going to be able to define what reasonable means right now, reasonable plan for moving, for example, staff, educators, and more importantly, students, into other schools by combining them, then yes, you have to have consolidation on the list. That's something that you have to be willing to do. Again, it's an unsavory thing to prioritize, but you can't take options off the table before you really know, all right, well, how are we going to cover this shortfall? If it's okay, this is not a question you asked me, but I want to answer it anyways. One of the things that I hope that, I hope that parents and voters take away from this year's election, especially, is that, we're being thrust into the position of having to deal with these budgetary problems again because our elected officials, especially at the state level, they're just not frankly doing their job. Like, we're putting public education on the chopping block because they don't want to have the tough conversation about raising funds, specifically not from taxpayers, but from certain taxpayers that aren't paying their fair share, in order to fund the public education system. And I bring this up because I think PPS could be a very powerful activist organization if it wanted to be. Because these people meet in legislative session in Salem. We can go and talk to them if they won't come and talk to us. And I feel like that is one of the number one things that the PPS board over the last couple of years is just not doing. And they're not.
So do you think that there hasn't been activism? I mean, do you think that people haven't been going to Salem? I mean,
No, I
that,
do.
okay, because
Absolutely.
that doesn't square with kind of, our,
Sure.
What we've seen over the past several years in terms
Right.
of massive showings at the Capitol.
Right. So advocacy is one thing, but I'm referring to activism. I'm talking about protests. I'm talking about resistance. I'm talking about coordination and organization. And a good example is, this question has come up a lot recently in the questionnaires that get sent out. How do we feel about the teacher strike that occurred? And the strange thing about that question when it comes up is the question kind of winds up pitting students against educators, against parents, against the community. And what's peculiar to me about that was about sort of that perspective on the teacher strike is that it is a manifestation of a larger problem that, in fact, students and parents and educators and the public here in Portland, we're all on the same side. We're all being subjected to these underfunding issues that, for example, cause teachers to go on strike. And what wound up happening is in Portland, the picket lines were the focus of a lot of derision from various parties. When in fact, I don't know, it just seemed to me, why is this all not being organized and brought, for example, onto the Capitol doorsteps down in Salem, where the problem actually is? Or, for example, over in City Hall, where part of the problem is. And so I wanted to be clear that, like, I understand that there has been a lot of advocacy, but the blunt fact is it has been ineffective. And so that's what I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, finish your thought, because I want to follow up.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I've said too much.
Well, I do want to actually get to the strike, and I'd like to know kind of, how would you have handled that differently? And what would you say was the crux of that?
Yeah, so the crux of the strike. Well, I'm not a member of the Teachers Association, so I can't exactly say, with any certainty. I mean, the motivations were one of many. And so my reaction to the strike was, it seemed that the complaints were that, initially there were a set of demands. And when those set of demands were negotiated and seemingly met, the set of demands may be changed and the strike got prolonged. And all of a sudden now parents are upset with teachers, students are out of school even longer. And, so my reaction to the strike is, well, it would have been, especially if I had been sitting on the board. In the beginning, when you're dealing with prioritized set of demands and there is an ongoing negotiation, it feels to me that the board, it is incumbent upon them to be supportive, especially when you have a labor group that is on strike and they are seeking the increase in pay, in benefits, in the work environment that they're in. There's nothing wrong with that. There's really nothing wrong with that. And when those set of demands can't be met, it was unfortunate to me to see the public kind of turn on teachers, and then for parents to turn on teachers, and then for everybody to turn on everybody else. Because like I said before, we're all in this together. Like we're all on the same side. Like we're not each other's problems, right? This strike originated from the fact that there's literally not enough money coming into the system to support the things that we want. For example, everybody would love to have smaller class sizes are a very effective way to improve educational outcomes for students. But how do you get smaller class sizes? You have to have increasing number of educators in order to get those class sizes down. Well, how do you do that? You have to be able to afford to hire these people. You have to be able to put them in the classroom so they have a place to teach. These things to me seem all very straightforward and trivial. And it always comes back to the fact that there just is not enough funding flowing into the PPS system in order to afford the things that we want. And the
So
things that we want.
I'm not
Sure.
clear in terms of what you would have done had you been on the board.
Yeah, so absolutely. So if I'll be more concrete then. So initially, if I had been on the board, I would have been very vocally supportive of the strike, because this is a labor union that represents the Teachers Association, and they have the legal right to that. It is not our position as the board, an advisory council basically, to dictate to that union what they are allowed to do. And more importantly, we're literally sitting here talking about, for example, budgetary shortfalls and cuts, removing more staff from central office, potentially having to lay off teachers. That is the underlying issue. That is the underlying issue fundamentally that wound up that forced the teachers to go on strike. And so I would have been very vocally supportive up to a point. Up to the point where you are no longer dealing with, for example, faithful negotiators. And I think that's the key transition. And then what you have to do is maybe step in and try to encourage everybody to be like, hey, so coming to resolution is probably important because we are supposed to be supplying a service to these students, which is educating them. And if the system is not doing that, we're not fulfilling our end of the bargain. And more importantly, when I talk about the activism piece, I would have loved to have seen more parent organizations, school organizations, student organizations, join those teachers on the picket line. And for example, maybe take those protests to City Hall. Maybe take those protests to Salem, where they can be more visible.
Great, thank you. Christy, what would you have done if you were on the board at the time?
So I guess one thing before I immediately dive into what I would have done differently, I just want to make sure that, because I think Ken and I maybe had different experiences of the strike. I actually feel like our parents were really supportive of the strike. I actually would get frustrated when the local news would find like the parents who were opposed, because at our picket line, we had tons of parents out. They were bringing treats. They were part of the picket line. We had kids who made posters and were there, especially early on. I do think the longer the strike dragged out, the harder it got on families. And also there started to be sort of tactics that people disagreed with or concerns about the math. For those of us who were close to it, it did seem like there was, at the crux of the argument, a disagreement about whether or not the district had funds that they could actually put toward meeting the demands of the teachers. What would I have done differently if it were me? I actually think, much like what Ken said, I probably would have been more supportive of the teachers and the strike as a school board member. I think one thing that's interesting is there's this real strong desire to kind of go along, to get along sometimes on school boards or in legislative bodies. And I think that what we had was a very toxic relationship. That's one of the reasons I'm running, right, is I want to kind of fix that toxic relationship, help fix it between the district and the schools, because it was and still is not great, but getting better. But I saw firsthand what it felt like to not get supported by the district at our school, for it to take 6 weeks to hear back from senior staff to address major issues we had at our school. So I've been there. And I think that had there been school board members that were more willing to talk about that dynamic, maybe it could have helped, but I think in the end, I'm not sure, even if I might have behaved differently, I don't know how much of a difference it would have made. We didn't have new leadership. There was that toxic relationship between the district and the teachers and between the district and the schools. And I'm just not sure that I could have done anything differently to fix that. Other than had I been on the board longer, maybe being a little bit more critical and showing that there were school board members who kind of knew firsthand what was happening in the schools and could kind of like help bridge that dynamic sooner, maybe, and that might have helped a little bit. I wish I had a better answer because that strike was really hard on families in the end and really hard on our teachers in the end. And I think it made a big difference in a lot of ways in raising the profile of the issues that we have in our schools and building solidarity between our community. I think actually it was a galvanizing experience, as far as I can tell, where people really felt like, oh my gosh, we have like school funding issues. This isn't the district like flushing money down the toilet or something. We actually like aren't getting enough resources. What do we do? And I've seen the outcome of that in a lobby day that I helped put on last February, where we had 50 parents come to Salem. We have another lobby day coming up next week that I'm supporting, where we have, I think, something like 100 PPS parents signed up to go down to Salem. And I don't know if the strike hadn't have happened, I'm not sure people would have been aware of the underlying issues.
So as a board member, knowing what the budget was and knowing the money that PPS had, you would be supportive of the teacher's position, even though they were misstating what was actually available.
I think being more supportive of the teachers is what I was trying to convey versus more supportive of the numbers that they were sharing specifically. But I want to go back to something Ken said, which is that's a struggle that I'm having too, is I think the teachers were thinking that they were right with those numbers. At least that's what it seems like. And we could go back in time, find out for sure, but I think people were crunching numbers from the budget just like Ken and I have been trying to do and finding it very challenging to figure out precisely what's going on, which is something I think both of us have talked about in a previous conversation. There's a lot of transparency. You could have the most transparency ever, but if people can't understand the language in which the documents are written in a way that can help them make sense of it, then it's not quite getting there, in my opinion. So I think that there was like a disagreement about the numbers, and in the end, I think the district's numbers were correct. I don't think it was malicious, but I do think that we could do better on making sure that our teachers have that information. I just wanted to say I think I would have been more supportive of them in general and the struggles that they have had in our schools post-pandemic, which have been serious, and I think they have felt unseen by the district.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to talk about the bond, and Christy, if you can go first on this. Do you support the bond, and what would you tell voters who are concerned about what currently appears to be plans to build the 3 most expensive high schools, or among the most expensive in the country?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's certainly been something that's on my mind a ton. It's what I've walked onto the school board. Please note, all of the bond work started. I got put in a week after it was voted out of the school board, but we have talked about it ad nauseum at probably every single board meeting since then. I think that I guess unequivocally, I support the bond. Unequivocally, I support the bond. I told the story of watching Lincoln High School students walk into a beautiful modernized high school. I think it demonstrates, especially to kids who are the most likely to leave school, like fifth graders aren't going to like stop coming to school, but like a junior or senior in high school, they're the ones we're trying to keep going to classes, keep our graduation rates. Like the one thing that Oregon schools do seem to be doing pretty well is increasing graduation rates. And I think that like improving our high schools so that we have better CTE programming, kids feel invested in, they're lovely places to be. They're not a metaphor for a lack of investment in their futures, but in the exact opposite, a metaphor for community investment in their future. So I'm a big supporter of the bond. The Cornerstone report that came out just after I got into office kind of laid to bear some of the differences in costs between different projects. Specifically, they compared the current projects to Lincoln and to Beaverton High School. And one of the things that I was a big supporter of was saying, there is no reason that these schools should have more bells, whistles, and square footage than Lincoln, which is a beautiful, modernized public school that has everything that kids need to succeed. So I've been really excited to see some of those cost reductions. It's hard to watch those cost reductions be paired with rising costs. So what would have been a bigger reduction becomes a smaller reduction. But I do think that that's been the right approach to take a look at that. It's been frustrating sometimes to hear it as, oh, they haven't even decided what they want to do yet. I think we're trying to be responsive to the process, and actually, instead of just pursuing the most expensive high schools and not trying to dig in on how to make them more affordable, we're actually digging in on how to make them more affordable and making them more equitable to Lincoln, as done before. I also think that Ken kind of alluded to looking at cities sometimes. Like, it's more expensive to build in Portland than it is in other places around the country. There are other major cities that have similar higher costs, but that's just reality. We have a different building code. I support that we have a stronger building code. I think it saves us money in the long run to build more efficient schools, to have clean energy embedded into our schools in the long run. I think those are solid investments, but it does mean that we pay more on the front end. So I'm excited to support the bond. I really hope that it passes, because the message that it will send to our kids and to our community that we are still invested in the future of our city. We're not giving into the doom spiral. We are saying we are here and we are going to continue to be a great place to raise a family at a time when I think sometimes those messages with like cuts to parks and things like that are currently being talked about. I think there's a lot of things happening here. Making it a great place to raise a family seems to be a little riskier or at risk sometimes. So I'm hoping that we can send the right message that this is still a great city to raise a family.
Great, thank you. And Ken, what about you? What are your thoughts on the bond? Do you support it? And what would you
Yeah.
tell voters?
These are great questions. I mean, this lays us bare as candidates. I think it's great. I'm a hard no on the bond. um, the cost is too high. The timelines are too long. And I think the only thing that this bond is going to do is further turn public sentiment against public education. And I think that at every opportunity, what will happen if this bond goes through is the prevailing winds, especially the most vocal opponents of public education at the state in the state house, and especially locally, they're going to use the bond as just a club to beat public education to death. And so, especially when I know for a fact that there is precedent in other major school districts throughout the country of solving similar problems that PPS has. A lot of these buildings are very old. They have real basic operational maintenance issues. One of the things that gets alluded to a lot is, for example, the HVAC system's failing in some of these schools. Who wants to go to school in an old brick school when it's super hot during the spring and late summer? Leaking roofs, real basic stuff like that. But we do have the opportunity, at least we did, to, for example, put forward micro bonds or emergency bonds, emergency loans. There are, for some of these, for example, energy and HVAC issues, putting forward partnerships with local energy companies where they basically float the money for deferring future costs of energy bills and infrastructure costs, where we basically get a loan for all intents and purposes to repair those systems. This is where I feel like the creative financing that the board could be bringing to the table, especially working with city leaders who are interested and invested in making public school better here, would come to bear, is to lead that initiative. And this is another one of these areas where I feel like maybe priorities got a little bit inverted. Because as you pointed out at the beginning, these are going to be some of the most expensive, not some of, these will be the most expensive public schools in the country. That's extraordinarily hard to justify when we're building. More importantly, these schools are being built to a population of students that I've looked through the population studies that Portland Community College published. They are on point. Additionally, Portland State had some too. I'm sorry, I said PCC. I meant Portland State. Portland State, their population studies, they're on point. Even in the margin of error, the number of students that we would need 10 years from now to justify the size of these schools and the square footage, the probability of that is extremely low. It's like under 1%. And so that's the other thing that kind of concerns me, is like, who are we building these schools for? Are we building these schools for the next generation of students, for people that we're trying to encourage to come to move to Portland? I've lived in a lot of places and I've visited a lot of places. I live in Portland at this point in my life because it's awesome. There aren't very many places in the world that have what Portland has, that has what Oregon has. This is an amazing place to live. And one of the things that will make it an attractive place to live for people who are looking to move, even though it's expensive, is being able to say, Portland's got great schools. And so one of the things that we really have to focus on in order to turn this tide is not making public sentiment even worse about Portland Public Schools. And I feel like that's what this bond is going to do.
Great, thank you. Anyone have any quick questions to that they want to jump in on? Teresa, or Laura, or Julia?
I'll do my lightning round real quick. So just one word, and we're starting with Ken? I lost track in the back. Okay. So who would you say that your main constituency is here if you were to win the board seat?
Yeah, it's the people who don't currently vote because they feel disenfranchised.
And Christy?
I'd say it's the families of the city of Portland. My first answer would be fourth grade kids. I feel like fourth graders are pretty with it. They started kindergarten during the pandemic. I'm here for those guys. They had online kindergarten. How are we going to make sure that they get through this all right?
Great, thank you. Let's see. Go ahead.
Sorry, my lightning round question is just which of the current school board members you feel like you are the most ideologically aligned with? And I guess I would start with Christy.
Great. Well, I think JJ Kunseve. I got told on Friday being asked the same question that I wasn't allowed to say JJ. But I think he's the one. If you haven't talked to him, he's our student representative, and he is prepared for meetings. He has ideas. He's committed to a mission of making sure student voice is heard. And when he sees things happening without student voice, he asks about it. He's always polite and lovely to be around. He cares about time management and making sure agendas are well functioning. And these are things that I can get behind. So I'm going to go with JJ Kunseve.
And how about you, Ken?
So sadly, public office is a thankless job for a reason. It's because you don't get fans, and I'm expecting the same if I'm elected. I wouldn't pick anybody in particular. I think everyone's kind of done their job in part as best they can, but no one in particular stands out.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. If each of you can just take 30 seconds to kind of, once again, like whatever you want readers or viewers and us to take away from this about why you're the best candidate, that would be great. And I think maybe, Christy, how about if you go first on this, and then Ken, you can have the last word.
Yeah, so I think I would just want to remind everyone that I've had a career in public service as a day job, and almost always had like a side hustle in public service as well. I've really done the work and built community here in Portland over the 23 years that I've lived here, and have a lot of relationships, deep ones, and I just really feel like bringing all of that experience and those relationships to bear in support of our public schools and in support of our public school kids, most importantly, that's what I want to do. And I think that I would really hope that that would be why folks would want to vote for me for to finish out the term.
Great, thank you. And Ken?
Yeah, for me, most of our conversation today centered around the fact that Portland Public Schools are in a crisis. And during a crisis, drastic change can't wait, especially when you've been waiting on change for, over a decade. And so for everybody that, gets the opportunity to watch this video, I would say, every position I've ever had in my life, personal or professional, you get 100% of me. And my objective is to work tirelessly towards, one seminal goal. I would like to imagine the legacy, if I was on the board, that I could leave behind is that we go from the public sentiment of being public, Portland schools aren't very good, to Portland schools are awesome. And I'm proud to have my kid as a member of that system. That's my objective. And I think we can achieve it. And I think that there is a plan. And I would encourage everybody, like I said, to visit my website where I lay out a lot of policies around that plan.
Great. Thank you both very much. We really appreciate it. This was a great discussion. If I have any more questions, I will follow up with an email. I'm just going to stop the recording.